you have your body open, you have arm position open, you lean forward, you're relaxed. Those are cues that show that you are comfortable and that you enjoy being with that person. If you're trying to be persuasive, then you change your movement and gestures further. You use more eye contact, you use more face-to-face body orientation. And what that means is you make sure that your body is perfectly facing the other person. And this is kind of just a personal anecdote, but one of the things that I train parents when I do parent training with families, one of the things that I train them to do when they're doing their 30-minute special time with their children, my little phrase is, your toes always follow your nose. And so when you think about face-to-face body orientation, that means that however the other person is oriented, you are going to be the same exact way. So if they turn this way, you match and turn. If they turn this way, you match and turn. And so the concept of toes follow your nose, if your body is facing this way and you just turn your head, you're communicating that this was your focus. Something has now drawn your attention away, almost as a distraction. And then when you're finished, of course, you're going to return back to where your body was oriented. And so you want to make sure that your orientation face to face is, very similar if you're trying to be persuasive. You're also more likely to lean forward and lean closer to others when you're being persuasive. So if you notice that someone is acting in those manners, you may key into, I wonder what they're trying to get me to do. So when we're talking about gestures, there are 5 main categories. Emblems is the first. Basically, the easiest way to think of that is a word substitution. So if someone holds out their hand to you without saying anything, what's the first thing that you think? And remember, they're ambiguous, so there's going to be a lot of different interpretations of that. But, I can even think of several right off the bat. But without saying a word, if someone stretches their hand out, they're communicating something. That is an emblem. So it could be, give me your hand. It could be, give me what you have. It could be, I want to shake your hand. So there are different emblems that it could be, but that's still, regardless, your outstretched hand is still an emblem. An illustrator, easy way to think of that is making a point. So if you're pointing a finger when you give directions, that's an illustrator. So you're trying to be a little more clear, you're trying to reinforce whatever is being said. And as kind of an aside, I have several friends who have worked at Disney, and I don't know if you all are aware of this, but people that work at Disney are not allowed to point. They have to use an open palm hand. So anytime they give directions, you will see they use their entire hand, because apparently pointing is offensive to some cultures. And so, again, culturally explicit nonverbals. And so they do not point fingers ever when giving directions, but we often will. We'll say, up the road, you turn, whatever, and we use our finger to kind of reinforce or, make sure that we're clearly communicating. Okay, our affect displays, and please pay attention to that. That's not affect, it's affect. Your affect displays are showing emotions. So that is what your face communicates depending on what you're feeling. So you have a glowing face when you're happy. That's an example. So your affect displays are basically your facial expressions indicating your emotions. Regulators, easy way to think of that, interaction control. In other words, it kind of regulates the conversation. So if you raise your hand, that would be a regulator showing that you want to continue with a conversation, especially in an academic setting. If you look away, that indicates that you are regulating the conversation in the other way, that you're almost turning the conversation off. So that interaction control, those are gestures that allow you to communicate without saying, I'm really interested in this or I'm really losing interest. Those are regulators. And then adapters are a way to satisfy your personal needs and adapt to the immediate situation. And so I don't really have a specific example for that, but really the way you can think about it is, remember we talked about communication, we want to have our needs met. And so the adapters are nonverbals that allow you to satisfy your need, but it's situational. And so, it changes and it's based on the context or the environment. So, what are the benefits to looking at those 5 categories? First one, very obviously, it's self-awareness. The importance of emblems is that they're used a lot. So emblems are probably going to be your number one nonverbal gestures. Unique emblems signal intimacy. And that makes sense because, here, let me go back for you. Oops, wrong way. If you talk about a word substitution, that can be very specific to the relationship. So if you are in a relationship with someone, you may have a very special gesture that you use that communicates something that no one else would know what that means. So unique emblems can signal intimacy in a relationship. It's almost like the inside joke, that's the spoken signal of intimacy between two people. Emblems are the unspoken intimacy signal. And you can pay attention to whether or not nonverbal cues contradict what is being said. And are you projecting feelings accurately? Something else to consider, because if you want to be self-aware of those categories and how they affect you and how, you are affected, etc., are you projecting feelings accurately? Are you interpreting them accurately? Are you not doing that at all? Those are important. Now, a caveat for you, due to ambiguity, it may not be a good idea to rely only on sending nonverbal messages, but the benefit is that people respond to you if you do that. So there's kind of a catch-22 there. It's not necessarily the best communication idea to really rely heavily on nonverbals because they're so ambiguous and they're hard to interpret. But people are very responsive when you use nonverbal messages. So sometimes you have to weigh the pros and the cons and, what's the best bet for you. Okay, so, we talked about movements and gestures. Now let's talk about eye contact. There are 4 functions of eye contact. The cognitive element is you're getting information about what a person is thinking. That's just pretty basic. And from a cognitive perspective, you can get more clear information about what they think or feel. It allows you to monitor the behavior of others. So that's basically your feedback method in nonverbal communication. It's regulatory, so we can get signals to talk or not to talk through eye contact. And it's expressive because it allows people to reveal their emotions. So you will witness a lot of emotional changes by making eye contact with people because you can see them cry or blink or widen their eyes or narrow their eyes. All of those communicate feelings. And so that expressive component of eye contact is crucial when you're interpreting nonverbals. And so to further illustrate that point, this chart, when are you most and least likely to make eye contact with someone? And I won't go through every single one of them because you can read that obviously, and you should have seen it in the book. But you are more likely to make eye contact when you like the person, when you're discussing easy topics, when you're trying to persuade or dominate. We talked about that. If you're extroverted, if you are listening rather than talking. And remember, we just mentioned that it is regulatory. There's a signal to talk or not to talk. And so if you're listening, you're more likely to make eye contact. And then if you're a female, you're more likely to make eye contact, which is kind of interesting. And so the opposites are also there. You're less likely to make eye contact on the flip side of those that I mentioned. And please, make sure that you're aware of those things. I guess there are 12, so 12 things that you can be a little more aware of. So when you're talking with someone, you can kind of key into Are they making eye contact? What might that mean? Are they not making eye contact? What might that mean? Okay, so your facial expression. Interpreting facial expression requires other orientation. And that makes sense because you have to be truly focused on the other person. Facial expressions change very quickly and they can be very subtle. So if you're going to interpret them, you have to be focused on the other person. 250,000, I'm going to say that again, 250,000, 250,000 possible expressions are exhibited by the face. So think about the interpretation of 250,000 expressions. Okay, you know, there are very, very few people that are experts in it because it's very, very difficult. Is that to say that you can't get better at it? No. With practice, you can get much, much better at reading facial expressions, but it is difficult and it does require that you really focus on the other person. Research suggests that women have a greater variety of expressions than men and that they smile more than men. And so that's what research says, but I'm curious, do you agree or disagree? And why do you think that might be? So if you want to reflect about that, that would be great. Facial expressions are contagious. So keep that in mind, that either what you are expressing can rub off on the other person or vice versa. They can rub off on you. And I think that's why, remember we talked about manipulative people and draining people in previous lectures, and some of the responses that I got in the posts were, oh my gosh, you know, I know exactly who I'm thinking of, and this is what, you know, this is why it's so frustrating to be around them. I honestly believe that so much of it is because expressions and nonverbals are contagious. And so if you're around somebody that is chronically complaining or chronically frustrated or chronically angry or chronically depressed, you deal with their nonverbal communication and you almost can't help but have some of that kind of trickle down into your own. And so, you know, that's something we need to be very aware of, that we need to make sure if we have people like that in our lives that we balance it with people who are, you know, not always communicating nonverbally negative things. And complex expressions, this seems very counterintuitive and I know that, but that's why I want to talk about it. Complex expressions are easier to interpret than simple ones. And that seems like, you know, how does that make sense? But what's interesting is when there are a lot of emotions being expressed, in other words, if it's a simple emotion, it's just one thing, that's very person specific. So, you know, there are people who laugh when they're scared. There are people who smile when, or who cry when they're happy rather. So simple expressions are sometimes very difficult to interpret because they can be interpreted in more than one way. Complex expressions, meaning, you know, there's so much emotion coming out that you can't interpret it any other way. It's very clear what is going on. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, there are 6 emotional categories that have been universally recognized as universal emotions. They are surprise, fear, disgust, anger, happiness, and sadness. And so I'll kind of briefly share what indicates those emotions in a facial expression, and then I have some examples that I want to show you, but I'm going to have to pull them up and kind of close this down, so we'll have to make that work in a minute. But okay, so 6 universal emotions have been recognized, meaning researchers have found that no matter where you live in the world, no matter what your experiences have been, no matter what your cultural background is, these are 6 emotions that are present in every people group in the entire world. Surprise is communicated nonverbally through a wide open eyes and open mouth. Fear is communicated through an open mouth and wrinkled forehead. Disgust is a curled upper lip, wrinkled nose, lowered brow, and lowered upper eyelid. And if you actually take the time to picture what I'm describing, you will actually see a surprised face, you will see a fearful face, you will see a disgusted face. So it's really quite interesting if you just envision those